engineer at ERIM Dolphin Development Project, and also Mr. Charlie Rattan, hydrogen trainer and business advisor at Charlie Rattan Associates, and our regular commentator and expert, Dr. Steve Griffiths, who is Senior Vice President of Research and Development at Khalifa University here in the UAE. So thank you everybody for joining us today. And we are going to be talking about clean hydrogen, but first I'd like to go to the bulletins that we hopefully have sent you and you've had a chance to look at, news bulletin. And perhaps Widya, as one of our new guests today, I'd ask you if any of those caught your attention. Stephanie, if we could have those up on the screen, please. The bulletin headlines. I can't seem to see them there, but I hope our viewers can. Yes, there they are. So Widya, did you have a chance to look at those, and did any one of those sort of stand out to you?
Yes, I think the one that's kind of like most outstanding for me is the first one, which is the policy. I think this is kind of like you know, like general issue for like low carbon energy transition in general, because that's kind of like the most like driver to support hydrogen economy. Like for example, like in the UK, I think like the green hydrogen, there's like there's a lot of like projects relevant to the offshore wind to produce hydrogen, but then there is no kind of like clear map, for example, on the consenting plan, and then there is and then we know that kind of like at the moment the hydrogen production, the cost to produce green hydrogen is actually quite high at the moment compared to, for example, gray hydrogen. So I think maybe there's some if there is like a clear support from the government, for example, in the terms of like the contract for difference for the price difference of hydrogen, that would be like one of the things that could support the economy as well. And then in terms of like other policies would be relevant to, for example, like quality assurance, and then like the safety associated with hydrogen, like the design codes and standard as well. I think there's also still quite gap in there. So, and then in terms of the regulation as well, there's a bit of like a gap on what to do like for new hydrogen projects. I mean, the onshore production projects is probably clearer in terms of the regulations, but like if you go to the offshore, for example, it's quite gray area. There is no kind of like requirements. I mean, like no clear requirements. In terms of that. I mean, so I think,
Are you talking about the UK and Europe?
Yeah, I'm talking about UK at the moment. Yeah.
Okay. Charlie, welcome, Charlie Rattan. And before I ask you about your article of interest, let me just ask you to comment on what Widya just said about regulations in the UK, and you're also based there, and you advise obviously a lot of companies and clients on wind energy and also hydrogen. You know, wind is obviously much of it is offshore, at least up north and in Scotland. Would you agree that policy in the UK, which I thought was actually ahead of the game in terms of clean energy, is still has some gaps to fill?
Yeah, it's been a hard battle for those of us involved in wind, and sometimes the policy and planning in particular doesn't align with the reality. Certainly offshore wind has been a real battle. The turbines are getting bigger. Sometimes there are community concerns as well, but there is a one-stop shop or two. There's one in Scotland now, and there's one in the rest of the UK with the Crown Estate bringing together key stakeholders to de-risk the process earlier on. So that is positive. On the hydrogen side, it's slightly farcical in that, to be honest, hydrogen isn't even allowed in the extant gas grid. It's banned. It's been banned since 1974, when there was a big push for natural gas. Not because people are evil, and obviously that needs addressing sooner rather than later, especially as we too aspire to be world hydrogen leaders in the UK. So there are certain anomalies on the policy side. The good news is that certain trade organisations, the All Party Parliamentary Group and others, are addressing exactly those anomalies. Watch that space, and hopefully they'll be sooner rather than later.
Okay, and Charlie, any one of those headline articles?
Having seen number one being addressed, number two is which countries could become the world's hydrogen superpowers? And I suppose there are a number making the early running. Let's not forget China, which is actually augmenting its talk with spend. But from the rest of the countries, that I've noticed significant signs of activity in Australia, where the resource, especially from renewable resource, solar and indeed now offshore wind, are plummeting in cost. So Australia is making moves. Elsewhere, we in the UK, obviously, we've got HyNet and we've got the East Coast Cluster and others. You might also want to look at the United States with its Earthshot proposals of cost reductions, and elsewhere in Asia Pac and Latin America, yesterday Brazil, and India is also on your list as well, with significant, a few false dawns, I suppose, on renewables in India, but there does seem to be a bit more joined up thinking. There's also some realities on the value chain, on the supply chain. How, it's all very well to have local content, but has to be realistic. So there are a whole heap of countries coming to the front. You might want to put Japan on that list. Obviously, Germany, Holland, the Nordic countries will be the drivers of, I expect, the green hydrogen. Rotterdam, Hamburg, Bremen, and some of the Nordic countries as well, really driving forward the green hydrogen agenda there.
And certainly driving forward the demand. And Dr. Steve Griffiths, let's go to you on that. And you're based in the Middle East, of course, this region. Big initiatives, a lot of money being invested into hydrogen initiatives in partnership with countries like Germany, with technology providers, etc. Very ambitious programs in Saudi, in the UAE in particular. A lot of spend. Let's look at that question number 2 bulletin. Which countries could become, and there's, we've, of course, you and I have talked in different forums about the GCC becoming, a successful region as a hydrogen exporter. What's the timeline for that, do you think, in terms of blue or green? Let's include blue in there, not just talk about, pure green hydrogen. What is the timeline, and can it be a successful regional exporter?
Well, we'll throw all the colors in there. It's nice to see you again, Dalia. Yes. No, it's an interesting conversation. So I think when you talk about superpowers, you first have to consider what it will mean to be a superpower in the energy system of the future. So with hydrogen, we know there's going to be a lot of local production, because now getting hydrogen from one place to another, if you're having to do international shipping, is very expensive. Costs a lot to get this form of energy moved across oceans. And so I think when you're looking at those that are going to be the most successful with hydrogen, it's those countries which are able to understand how to best utilize hydrogen and its derivatives, and be able to produce it the best locally if they don't have a good supply chain to provide low-cost hydrogen. So I think the major consumers that we know, Japan, of course, they've had a hydrogen strategy for some time. They're very much at the forefront of being able to consume well, and being very proactive in how they're going to consume hydrogen, although they're not going to be able to do the production and consumption very effectively together, because we know their resources are not that abundant with renewables, although they have some, and they're not a major hydrocarbon economy. So that they're going to be importing, and most Northeast Asian countries are going to be importing. Although, look at a country like China, when you start to talk about Asia, they have a lot of coal. If they can clean it up, then they have a source of hydrogen which they're leveraging today, which is dirty. They can always make it more sustainable through carbon capture, whatever form of sustainability they have behind their production. In Europe, of course, leading, I think, in policy and development. We talked about our colleagues here from the UK. I mean, these countries are very proactive in looking at both the technology side for supply, also on the demand side, knowing where they want to have clusters created so that they can create that demand, which I think is the most important thing now, is having clusters. In the Middle East, when you talk about these kind of countries, you talk about a country like Chile, which wants to export, Australia. It's, if you can't find a way to really leverage locally industries which need supply of hydrogen or derivatives, say ammonia, it's going to be hard to create yourself as a superpower. And that's my personal view. Now, that said, I do think when we talk about the timelines and we talk about where you can create great leverage and advantage, in the very near term, as we all know, if you have a very low cost supply of natural gas or other hydrocarbons, say natural gas for steam methane reforming, the blue hydrogen, now not so much turquoise, different technology, but the blue, get the steam methane reforming, get your CO2 captured, have hydrogen, which you can then use for local products. If you're going to be doing something with ammonia for fertilizer, if you're going to be able to transport ammonia to places that need it and have a demand for it, like Japan. I think in the near term, we'll see probably more blue hydrogen in this region as the green hydrogen costs come down. In other places in the world where electrolysis comes down in cost, Although now there are places with good solar resource, good wind resource, we're already seeing some parallels between the cost of the hydrocarbon-based hydrogen and then the clean hydrogen. So I think between now and 2030, you see a trade-off between the hydrocarbon-based hydrogen, which is our blue shades, so to speak, and then the green hydrogen as the costs come down around green. Superpowers being those that can leverage one form or the other and then utilize that for their local industries to get things going around clusters and different domestic needs.
Yeah, I mean, okay, well, let's just go back to you on the cluster and I just look again at this region, and maybe I'll put the same question to Widya and Charlie for the UK or Europe. But as far as the Gulf is concerned, or the Middle East, what obvious local clusters or local industries could make use of blue hydrogen? As you said, we have a natural gas advantage here in the region in terms of cheap, plentiful nat gas. Are there any obvious industries here that could tomorrow make use of blue hydrogen that aren't already? And do we have the distribution investment commitment for that?
Well, I mean, I would start with refineries and ammonia producers because they're already using hydrogen, so they just have to clean it up, and they're naturally going to be off takers. If you see the region here, I mean, everyone's talking about their ammonia projects because ammonia uses hydrogen. So you got blue ammonia, you have green ammonia, whatever shade you want. It's just going to be the shade of the hydrogen that goes into the molecule. Mm-hmm. That makes sense because ammonia is already being produced and you're not going to change anything around the production process except having a cleaner version of hydrogen going into the molecule to support the nitrogen component to that, so that you have a clean form of ammonia that you can use for fertilizer or whatever other use. I mean, Japan, they want to use ammonia for power. We want to use it for shipping fuel. If we're doing the refining and the ammonia production around a port, you can always start thinking about bunkering, because we talk about shipping is going to have ammonia potentially as a major decarbonization option for its fuels. So I think in the region here, we're perfectly set up to take blue hydrogen if we can do something about making come back to this point about the whole supply chain of natural gas not being leaky, et cetera. If you can verify that you don't have a leaky methane supply chain, you're capturing the CO2 where it needs to be captured, and you have a verifiably low carbon form of blue hydrogen, ammonia, refining, and then I'd also look at the ports and bunkering ammonia for shipping fuel. It can get things going fast, very fast, and then green hydrogen or whatever can come in as it gets more cost effective, and we can leverage up the demand already created. So to that extent, as I said, local ability to utilize hydrogen and derivatives can help you become a superpower to the extent that anyone can be a superpower with hydrogen. It's not going to be the oil and gas sector of the future in that level of revenue generation for countries, but it can be a good business where there's opportunities to be had.
Widya, let's go to you back to you and ask you about some partnerships to get these going. Obviously a lot of parties need to be working towards this initiative of getting hydrogen off the ground, clean hydrogen, green hydrogen in particular. The IEA has called for doubling in private investment that we will need by 2030. That's kind of planned already. Do we have enough commitment from the private sector? You mentioned public policy earlier, but in terms of funds going to hydrogen projects versus other clean energy, where would you say the UK or Europe stands on that? And is it too competitive?
I think in the UK we do have quite a government support for hydrogen projects. I think which is part of what we call six budget on climate or something. So I think there's about a few £100 million basically dedicated for hydrogen. But say
private sector though, what about
this?
The private?
No, this is the government funding. So that's not still that's not adequate, I must say. But then to allow basically private sector, I don't think we see a lot of the investment in private sector, but essentially to allow investors to come in. For example, on our project, we do need government funding at the beginning of the project when we do the feasibility study and stuff, and then the private sector then come in when they have enough confidence that the project would go on. So I think that's the difficulty. I mean, there should be enough government funding to allow the investor to be secure. But in terms of private investment as well, what I think as well, there's for example, on the financial institution, at the moment, there is no clear kind of like a policy on what the company, in terms of the EU, for example, there's been talk about this EU taxonomy, which basically define how the companies should basically disclose their their projects in terms of the low carbon projects, for example. But this EU taxonomy is still quite unclear at the moment. So there is no clear like financial reporting requirements on that aspect, which makes the financial investments like the World Bank and so on is probably quite doubtful to start investing investing as well.
Charlie, why is the EU taxonomy taking its time? We keep, what's the interest?
Well, it's not renowned, is it, of being the most agile of organisations, and I suppose we in the UK have made our own decisions as to its value. I suppose aligning stakeholders with varied views is difficult, and that is on a national level as much as on a regional and sectoral level. So to get stakeholder alignment takes time. It's not all negative. Just to put on a positive side of things, on the private side that Widya was addressing, there are corporate social responsibility aspects to most private sector companies. They're aligned with the UN 17 sustainable goals. I support them through UNIDO and their development approach to hydrogen. And so it's not all just about waiting for policy, because that tends to lag the reality. The private sector can drive it, especially with the clusters that Steve Griffiths mentioned. You don't have to wait for somebody to push some pens and produce some paper. It's happening organically, I suspect, on the ground, in that stakeholders and private companies are seeing the commercial benefits. There is a bit of an elephant in the room here in the UK as who pays for all of this, because it's not going to be cheap, whether it'll be some kind of disguised carbon tax, whether it's just going to be already energy is a political issue here in the UK and beyond. So that does need addressing. Some perhaps we've got contracts for different mechanisms that have supported Widya's kind of sector in offshore wind. Perhaps something along those terms might emerge here in the UK. Whether the Europe goes along a similar route, we shall have to wait and see. But the time, I think, is just that it just takes time to get a lot of stakeholders pointing in the same direction and agreeing to the same things. It's not always easy.
And also it takes time to scale up, and obviously to do that, the technology that allows you to do that, if you like.
Yeah, we're talking.
Where are we with that?
Yeah, we're talking about giga projects, aren't we? But the reality is that the biggest electrolyzer, I think, is 20 megawatts. And to go from there to these big, to go to the scale required for cost reduction to 1 gigawatt, well, how are we going to do that? I think Project NEOM is looking at a lot of small units and then aggregate them, but that's not necessarily the most effective. So there is a bit of dissonance, isn't there, between the actuality of 20 megawatt projects built as to talking every day. There's an announcement of some eye-popping figure, but they're not yet there. It's talk. So let's see how we get from 20 megawatts to 100 megawatts, 150, and then ultimately to gigawatt scale projects to get the cost down.
Do we need more pilot projects on the technology front to sort of try and achieve that gigawatt, exponential, capacity, if you like? I mean, what will take us there? More money or more tech, more partnership? What will make us make that leap forward?
To some extent, I don't really think pilot projects that are small scale one-offs that we're seeing all over the place are that sensible. I mean, is it Charlie was saying, as I was saying, when you have a cluster and you have the ability to start producing a cleaner form of hydrogen that already has a demand it can meet, you've got a business case that can be developed around that. You're not purely doing something for the greater good. So what we do want to do is see larger scale supply meeting larger scale demand, going into areas we know are decarbonizing and going to have to use hydrogen. So the case near term, long term is there. If you're going to be producing anything around shipping, if you're looking long term of aviation fuels, if you're looking at the iron and steel sector, if you're looking at the chemical sector, all these sectors, as they evolve into a net zero world, they're going to have to find a way to decarbonize. If you're able to create a project with these different sectors and produce whatever variation of hydrogen you like, as long as it's clean and verifiably clean, I think that is a project which could be okay. We'll call it a pilot project, whatever, but it needs to start to get to reasonable scale so that you're having a meaningful decarbonization impact on the current business. And you have a roadmap to going to full scale deployment for that organization you're working with, because you don't want to stop at some point and say, it looked good, but now what? You need that roadmap to taking a sector in your home country area, or if you're working with someone abroad, make sure there is that roadmap to taking your demonstration to full scale. I mean, I see this all the time. I do a lot of things in digital, and everybody wants to do something in digital, and they forget that they're going to have to eventually have all the data they're getting in their pilot utilized at the large scale, but they didn't realize how are we going to actually do this? So scale it up, make it useful. So amongst all these areas that we call the fourth industrial revolution and looking toward the net zero economies, a lot of parallels in how we have to think. Do your pilots, but always do your pilots within the context of preparing for something that's larger scale and going to have a positive impact on the business.
And I mean, in terms of blue hydrogen in this region, Steve, you know, there's still there's a lot of CO2 emissions still using that process. And of course, you've got, you know, some good progress on the CCUS front, carbon capture, etc., and a lot of investment happening in this region again on that. But does that need to progress for, you know, for the scaling up, if you like, from using for blue hydrogen to be successful and to be accepted, so that we can clean the emissions as we're using that?
So for the blue hydrogen, and I'll also bring in a comment on turquoise, you know, that's where you have the pyrolysis, and you're not creating CO2, you're just creating carbon as the byproduct. For the blue hydrogen, what I'm most concerned about is making sure the natural gas supply chain is verifiably clean and not leaky. We've seen papers published from our colleagues in the US where, you know, they talk about the US system and, you know, have a 2%, 3% methane leak rate when you're going from methane from the supply source to the reformer. That's not what we're seeing in Europe. And that's not what we definitely hope to see here in the UE. We're talking about something less than 1%, probably 0.5, 0.7%. So if you can monitor your natural gas supply chain and have a good solid way of verifying along the supply chain that you're not leaking methane, I think the carbon capture and the low carbon intensity or low carbon equivalent intensity of blue hydrogen can be something that's verifiable, and we can make that a future fuel, which is not going to have as much debate. Now, that said, not everyone has the ability to utilize the CO2 that they capture. We can't always geologically store it, and we're still working on ways to utilize it in product. So the turquoise hydrogen, I have seen myself some interesting things that we're doing around how you find the markets for the carbon, which is produced in a solid form. You know, we have different technology working on to take the carbon into concrete production, making very high strength, sustainable concrete. You know, it would be great for this country because we build so much. So I tell the oil company, why don't we do the pyrolysis, get the carbon, forget this, you know, the geological storage thing and all that, take the solid carbon, let's do something with other sectors. So I think trying to find those sector activities around either CO2 or solid carbon to get value from the byproduct is going to make the natural gas or whatever hydrocarbon form of H2 much more viable for the future.
I mean, carbon reuse, you know, in the sense that you're mentioning that, Steve. Charlie, just back to you. I mean, carbon management in general, you know, there's a lot of initiatives out there and projects. Of course, you have to have a price to make those kind of things work. And there's a lot of debate around, you know, standards around that, etc., credits. But the market, nevertheless, the carbon capture market is growing, you know, exponentially. Could be worth, I have a price, you know, carbon, $100 billion is the potential size of the carbon market by 2030, the voluntary carbon market. You know,
here in the UK, obviously we do have an oil and gas industry, and I think that's integral into our HyNet proposal, which is a blue based. When I was with Shell, we used to support Stanlow refinery just down the road from me, and I see that a planning application's already gone in for pipelines to reuse expended gas reservoirs in the Irish Sea. So we'll see how the business case stacks up. Carbon capture hasn't been an unalloyed success. We saw at Pilbara in Australia that I think that was a Chevron scheme that hasn't delighted some of the stakeholders out there. So it does need careful handling. But here in the UK, depending on who you talk to, the clusters that Steve mentioned are, the full title is carbon capture and storage and hydrogen clusters. So the blue hydrogen thing is absolutely baked in here in the UK. We are an oil and gas economy. some of the European ones, Germany, the Nordic countries, perhaps less so. So there are differences here in the blue green. It's not blue versus green, it's blue and green as far as I'm concerned, with some synergies between them. But the blue is integral here in the UK. So we'll see how the planning applications, it is online, they are discoverable. The planning application gone in for, I think, Cheshire West for Stanlow out to the Irish Sea, and the timings are very good. The gas reservoirs are expended round about the same time. If it goes through the planning process smoothly, the timings are quite good, which will uplift the business case, which is what it's all about. As for the carbon tax, I know that the Canadians and others are a bit more upfront. Not every politician wants to indicate that taxes are coming, but it will have, as I said earlier, have to be paid for somehow by someone. I've got a pretty good idea as to who that might be.
Yeah, well, I mean, also in coordinating across the board. Widya, just to go back to you on a couple of points. One is, you've been talking about you need more funding from public sector. But what about from the financial sector? There's been, again, banks in general, in terms of how that affects some of the projects you're working on your clients. The banks are under great pressure to, obviously fund clean energy as opposed to conventionals. Do you find that the financial sector and all the instruments it's creating is open to clients that you advise on that front and is even competing in that space?
I think regional bank, for example, like here in the Europe, it's like the ERBD. They're more active in providing funds for the project. But I think in terms of the private banks, for example, there is kind of like less involvement from them. I think it's just because at the moment, like for the finance sector, for example, the financial reporting requirements, that's not really clear at the moment, like what I mentioned on the EU taxonomy. So I think they're still waiting for that kind of like sector to move forward first before they become more active. But I think I must add for the in terms of the blue hydrogen project, I think it's definitely like a way forward to enable like commercial development of the green hydrogen, for example, because in EU, for example, because that's quite easy to implement for industrial clusters. In EU, for example, they've got a plan for like what they call hydrogen valleys, which is essentially about like 32 industrial clusters, if I'm not mistaken. And then this is, so they're trying to look at how to, how to develop the blue hydrogen, mostly on the blue hydrogen first, and then after that move forward to the green hydrogen. It's basically the same in the UK here. I think Charlie mentioned like the HyNet, which is part of the Northwest industrial cluster as well. And then there's also either kind of like initiative like on the carbon capture project, for example, and the Acorn project, which is in Scotland, which they're planning to use like the depleted oil and gas reservoir and then the pipeline as well, just to inject the CO2 into the reservoir.
Thank you, Jess. Steve, I'll go to you for the last comment today. We've already run out of time, believe it or not, but just on certification, just as we're talking about trying, the carbon market, trying to get some international agreement on, what about certification around the hydrogen question in general? Is that an issue? Do we need that to be inter-regional or not, considering that obviously some people will be producing the product and others will be importing, and how much of an obstacle is that?
I think it's a big one. So we talk about all these colors of hydrogen. We talk about we're going to export hydrogen, we're going to import hydrogen, we're going to use it in products, but we still don't have a commonly agreed standard that we can leverage off to certify hydrogen that we're trying to use locally or internationally. So if I were to comment on one thing, we really got to get straight right now. What is the common terminology we're going to use for hydrogen? How do we take that common terminology into certifications, which can then be used for our industries and with our partners? That is essential, and I'm glad you brought that up as a final point.
Okay, well, thanks very much to Dr. Steve Griffiths and Charlie Rattan and Vidya Wahyuni for joining us for the first time. And hopefully we'll look forward to having you on the show again. Thanks very much, everybody, for joining us today for our energy transition dialogues.
Thank you.